The morning my son-in-law realized my catering company had just been awarded the contract his restaurant group had spent 8 months chasing, he went completely still on the other side of the boardroom table. Not angry, not loud. Just still, the way people go still when something they never believed possible is suddenly sitting right in front of them. I watched his face from across that table and thought about the evening 3 years earlier, so hard at my idea, when he laughed so hard at my idea that he nearly knocked over his wine glass. 31 years of marriage had taught me what my husband Gerald's laugh meant. Gerald Whitfield laughed warmly, deeply, the kind of laugh that made you feel included. But my son-in-law Colin Ashworth laughed differently. Colin's laugh was the kind that made you feel small before he even finished the sound. That evening had started simply enough. Our daughter Serena had cooked dinner at their house in Oakville. The kind of careful dinner she always prepared when she wanted everyone to feel comfortable. Roast chicken, wild rice, the good wine. Colin selected himself from wherever he selected things. Gerald and I drove out from Burlington, the way we did most Sunday evenings back then. Those dinners still mattered to me. I was trying to hold something together long after the cracks had already spread through everything. We were nearly finished eating when I heard myself say it. I want to start a catering company. The table didn't go dramatic. It went confused. Gerald set down his fork slowly. Serena looked at me with something careful in her expression. Colin leaned back in his chair and tilted his head slightly the way he always did when he thought something was not worth taking seriously. I kept talking because stopping would have been worse. I want to focus on corporate catering. Businesses that need lunch service, private events, that sort of thing. I've been researching it for months. Colin smiled first. That particular smile, the one he saved for conversations he considered beneath him. Corporate catering. He said it the way you'd repeat back something a child had announced at the table. Mom. He had started calling me Mom sometime during their 2nd year of marriage, and the word never once sounded like affection. You're 62. I know how old I am. That industry is brutal. The margins are thin. The hours are terrible. The liability alone. I understand the risks, do you? His tone shifted then. The pleasant surface still there, but something sharper underneath. Because I've been in the hospitality industry for 15 years and I watch restaurants fold every single month. People with actual experience, actual capital, actual connections. I have experience. He smiled again. Home cooking isn't catering, Beverly. Home cooking isn't a business. Beverly. Not Mom anymore. That was deliberate. Gerald cleared his throat softly. He was a careful man, my husband. He chose his moments. Bev knows what she's doing in a kitchen. Colin looked at him briefly, then back at me, and laughed again. I'm not questioning your cooking. I'm questioning whether this is a realistic idea for someone at your stage of life. Stage of life. 2 words that arrive like a closed door. Serena touched her husband's arm. Colin. He held up both hands in the gesture that meant he was only being reasonable. I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to protect her from spending money on something that isn't going to work. You need commercial kitchen space, licensing, insurance, staff, a client base. You're not starting a bake sale. I looked down at the tablecloth for a moment. White linen, very clean, the kind Serena kept because Colin preferred things that looked a certain way. Then I looked up. You're right, that it isn't a bake sale. And no, I haven't done it before professionally. But I've been running the hospitality committee for the Business Association for 11 years. I've organized over 200 corporate events. I know what companies need, and I know what they're currently paying for it. Colin blinked once. Then he laughed for the 3rd time that evening, and this one was the worst, because it was the quietest, just a breath through his nose, a small shake of his head. That's volunteering, Beverly. That's not running a company. Gerald drove home mostly in silence that night. Somewhere past Appleby Line, he said, Don't let him get to you. I stared out the passenger window. He didn't get to me, but something had cracked open in my chest, and I already knew it wasn't going to close quietly. That was the thing nobody warned me about. Humiliation doesn't arrive like a fire. It arrives like water, patient, slow. It finds the places you thought were solid and it works its way in until one day you realize the structure isn't as strong as it once was. I had spent 62 years learning to be useful to other people, raised 3 children, kept a house. Spent 11 years building the Burlington Business Association's events program, from a coffee and pastry situation into something that actual sponsors competed to be part of. I had organized galas, luncheons, retirement dinners, charity auctions. I knew product launchers, I knew the pricing, I knew what a venue coordinator looked like when they were overselling their kitchen capacity. I knew all of it, but because my name was never on a business registration, because I had done it all as a volunteer, it apparently counted as nothing. That was the night I started noticing things differently. The way Colin subtly redirected conversations at family dinners whenever I spoke about anything business-related. The way he talked over me to Gerald about renovations to their property, as though I couldn't possibly have a useful thought about real estate, having owned homes for 40 years. The way Serena watched all of it, with an expression I couldn't quite read and never challenged. I loved my daughter fiercely. I want to be clear about that, but Serena had married a man who required a great deal of management, and over time that management had become the organizing principle of her life. Gerald noticed too in his quiet way. One evening, about 6 weeks after that dinner, while we were walking along the waterfront trail, he stopped and turned to look at me. I nodded. Then do it. His voice was very simple. What if Colin's right? What if I'm too late? Gerald walked a few steps before answering. You once reorganized the entire catering logistics for the lieutenant governor's visit on 48 hours' notice because the original company had a flood. I remember. You didn't sleep for 2 days and everything went perfectly, and you were back volunteering the following week like nothing had happened. I remembered that, Beverly. He stopped again. That's not a hobby skill. That's just a skill. I started quietly that same month. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement. I spent 6 weeks building a business plan at the kitchen table while Gerald read in the other room. I researched commercial kitchen rental spaces in Burlington and Hamilton. I contacted the Hamilton Food Business Incubator and attended 2 of their free workshops for new food entrepreneurs. I spoke with a food safety inspector I had met through the business association, and she walked me through provincial licensing requirements over a 90-minute phone call. I registered the company on a Tuesday morning in November, standing at the counter of our kitchen with my laptop open and Gerald's coffee cooling beside mine. I typed the name slowly. Whitmore Kitchen Co. I had kept my maiden name for 33 years of marriage, kept it legally alongside Marchetti, my married name. I had always liked the sound of it. Whitmore was my grandmother's family. She had fed entire neighborhoods during hard years and never once thought of herself as remarkable for it. I pressed submit. Gerald looked up from his crossword. Done, he asked. Done. He smiled at his crossword and said nothing else. That was enough. The first 3 months were, in all honesty, humbling. I rented time in a shared commercial kitchen in East Hamilton and drove 40 minutes each way. I sent introduction letters to 47 businesses in the Burlington and Oakville corridor. I called contacts from the business association that I hadn't spoken to in years and asked, quietly and professionally, if I could send them information about a new catering service. Most of them were kind. Several never wrote back. One man, a developer I had worked with on a chamber luncheon, replied to say they had a vendor they were happy with and wished me luck in a tone that suggested he did not actually wish me luck. I kept driving to Hamilton. I kept developing menus. I kept adjusting my pricing after looking at what comparable services were charging and realizing I had initially undersold myself by nearly 30%. The first real call came on a gray Thursday in February. A woman named Sandra Okafor, operations manager for a mid-sized accounting firm in downtown Burlington. She had received my letter, she said. She was organizing a working lunch series for their professional development program. 12 people, every second week for 6 months. Nothing fancy. Could I do something like that? My hands were very steady when I wrote down the details. My voice was very steady when I gave her my rates. Inside, I was something else entirely. We'll try it for the first session, Sandra said, and see how it goes. That first delivery. I still think about it sometimes. I loaded my car in the dark at 6:15 in the morning, drove to Hamilton, picked up the prepared items, drove to Burlington, set up in their small boardroom kitchen with the equipment I'd brought, and had everything arranged and labeled and perfectly temperature controlled by 11:45. When Sandra walked in at noon, she paused in the doorway and looked at the table and said, Oh, this is lovely. 2 words. But they landed somewhere I hadn't expected. By April, Sandra's firm had extended the series and referred me to another office in the same building. That referral led to 2 more. By June, I had 7 regular corporate clients and a waiting list of 3. I didn't tell Colin any of this. I didn't tell him because I understood by then that my growing would feel to him like a threat. I wasn't sure why exactly. I only knew that some people build their confidence on the assumption that certain others will stay exactly where they left them. Serena knew, of course. I told her over coffee one Saturday morning when Colin was golfing. She listened carefully, and when I finished describing the first 6 months, her eyes filled in that particular way that meant she was working hard not to cry in front of me. Mom, I smiled. It's going well, Serena. She reached across the table and held my hand for a moment without saying anything. I think you knew it would, she finally said. I wasn't sure I had known. But I was starting to believe it. The first time Colin heard about the business from someone other than family was at a charity golf tournament in Halton Hills that September. I wasn't there. Gerald told me what happened later, with the slightly careful tone he used when he was editing for my benefit. Apparently, one of the tournament's corporate sponsors, a man named Fletcher Drummond who ran a commercial real estate development group in Mississauga, had mentioned the Whitmore Kitchen Co. at the 19th hole. Said his admin had used us for a board lunch and the feedback had been exceptional, Gerald said. Colin nodded politely and said he'd heard of it. He had never asked me a single question about the business. That evening, Colin called, not to ask about the catering company, to check on something to do with a family cottage booking. But toward the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, he said, I heard someone mention your little catering thing today. Little catering thing. I kept my voice very even. Oh, yes? Apparently they used you for something. He sounded the way people sound when they're pretending to be casual. Must have gone well. It did. A pause. Well, good for you. That was all. No curiosity, no congratulations. Just the briefest possible acknowledgement before he moved on. I set down the phone and sat quietly at the kitchen table for a moment. Gerald appeared in the doorway. Colin? He asked. I nodded. Gerald made a sound that was not quite a word and went to put the kettle on. The winter of that year brought something I had not planned for. Gerald had a cardiac event in December. Minor, the doctors said. Caught quickly, managed well, stable. But the word minor doesn't arrive in your body as minor when you are sitting in a hospital corridor at 2 a.m, watching the door to your husband's room. I postponed 3 client events that week. Sandra Okafor sent flowers. 2 other clients reached out personally to ask how Gerald was doing. Not how the catering was, how Gerald was. I still think about that. Gerald recovered well and was adamant, absolutely adamant, that I not slow down the business on his account. He started coming to early morning pickups with me when the doctor cleared him for it. He would sit in the passenger seat with his travel mug and review whatever I needed reviewed and hand me things from the back and generally be present in the particular way that Gerald was present, which was quietly and entirely. You know, he said once, on the way back from Hamilton in February, I think this is the best thing you've ever built. I kept my eyes on the 403. I've built a few things, he smiled at the window. You know what I mean? I did know. And somewhere in that dark car on that gray winter highway, I allowed myself to believe him. By the 2nd year, Whitmore Kitchen Co. had moved out of rental space. I had leased a small commercial kitchen unit in a shared food production facility in Burlington's East End. 3 employees, including a part-time prep cook named Agnes, who had spent 20 years in restaurant kitchens and whose calm competence in a busy kitchen was worth every cent I paid her. We had 18 corporate clients on contract, ranging from monthly to weekly service. We had catered 2 private galas, a product launch, and a retirement event for the incoming president of the Burlington Chamber of Commerce, where apparently several attendees asked the event organizers specifically who had done the food. Fletcher Drummond's company became a regular client. He was pleasant to deal with, direct and prompt in all communication. And he mentioned once that his assistant had told him the Whitmore presentation was the best working lunch she'd experienced in 12 years of corporate administration. I thanked him and said nothing else. But I wrote it down when I got home. I kept a small notebook of those moments, not out of vanity, out of evidence. Because there are years when you need proof that you are not imagining your own competence. Colin had become quieter about the business as it grew. He no longer called it a little catering thing. He didn't call it anything, which in a way was its own kind of answer. Serena told me once, carefully, that he occasionally mentioned it in passing to his colleagues. She said he introduced me at a Christmas party as his mother-in-law who runs the Whitmore kitchen. Not who volunteers, not who putters around, who runs. Small adjustments. I noticed them all. The trouble arrived in spring of the third year, and like most real trouble, it arrived sideways. I had submitted a proposal for the corporate catering contract with Halton Regional Municipality. It was the largest contract I had ever bid on. Multi-site, year-round, significant volume. The kind of contract that would move Whitmore Kitchen into an entirely different category of business. I had worked on the proposal for 6 weeks. Every detail. Staffing projections, food safety certifications, supplier documentation, carbon footprint considerations, all of it. Fletcher Drummond had offered to write a reference letter, which he did, and it was generous and specific. 10 days before the decision was announced, I received a call from the procurement coordinator. "Ms. Whitmore," she said carefully, "we've received some information that's given us pause." I set down my pen. "What kind of information?" "A suggestion that your company may not have the operational capacity to handle a contract of this size, that your staffing is limited, and that your production facility is not adequate for regional scale." I kept my voice completely even while something cold moved through my chest. Who provided this information? I'm not at liberty to say, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to respond before we move forward. I thanked her. I told her I would provide profit documentation of our facility, staffing, and operational protocols by end of week. I asked her to please hold the process until she had reviewed it. Then I ended the call and sat very still at my desk. I already knew. I sat with the knowledge for 1 full day before I called Serena. She arrived at the house within an hour. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I explained what had happened, and I watched her face as I spoke. By the time I finished, she was not crying. She was something past crying. "Mom, I haven't confirmed it." She shook her head once. "He's been worried about the Halton bid since you mentioned it. He has his own restaurant group bidding on corporate catering territory this year. He said something at dinner last week, something about how small operators don't understand scale." I thought he was talking generally. I looked at my hands on the table. "He called someone," Serena said quietly. "I don't know who, but I know he made calls." I had suspected it. Hearing it still felt like stepping onto ice that wasn't solid. That evening, I made 3 phone calls. One to Sandra Okafor, who had become more than a client over 3 years, and who listened, and then said, very calmly, "Send me everything, and I will write you the most detailed reference letter that woman has ever read." One to Agnes, who said she would document our kitchen operations so thoroughly that no one could question our capacity. And one to Fletcher Drummond, who was quiet for a moment after I explained the situation, and then said, "This sounds like someone who feels threatened, and threatened people do stupid things." He paused. "Do you need me to call someone?" I said I would let him know. That week I submitted a 47-page operational response to the municipality. Facility documentation, staffing plan, supplier certifications, food safety audit results, client testimonials, financial projections, service records from 31 contracted events. Sandra's reference letter was 4 pages, and detailed enough to function as a business case study. I did not confront Colin. Not yet. I needed the contract first. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. The coordinator's voice was professional and warm. "Ms. Whitmore, the committee has completed its review. We'd like to offer you the Halton Regional Corporate Catering contract." I said thank you. I wrote down the details. I thanked her again and asked her to send the formal documentation to my email. Then I sat in my office and cried for approximately 4 minutes. Not dramatically. Just completely. When I called Gerald, he didn't say much. He just said, "Bev," and the way he said it contained everything. I told Serena that evening. She was quiet for a long moment. "Are you going to say something to Colin?" I thought about that carefully. "Yes, but not today." She nodded slowly. She looked tired in a way that had been building for a while. "Mom." She hesitated. "I've been thinking." I waited. "I don't want to do this anymore. This thing where I watch and don't say anything. where I adjust and smooth things over and pretend I don't notice. I stayed very still. Her voice dropped. He didn't believe in you. He actively tried to stop you, and I just sat there. You were in a difficult position, I said. I meant it. That's not an excuse. She shook her head. You spent your whole life making things easier for everyone, and I just kept letting him make it harder for you. The thing about hearing your child apologize for something real is that it arrives differently than you expect. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like grief. Grief for the years it took to get there. And something else underneath. Something quieter. Gratitude, maybe, that it arrived at all. I held her hand across the table and we sat in silence for a while. I did speak to Colin. Not at a family dinner. Not publicly. I asked Serena to let me come by on a Tuesday evening, when it would only be the three of us. He knew something was coming. I could see it in the way he carried himself when I arrived. That studied casualness of a man preparing defenses. We sat in their living room. Serena sat beside me on the sofa. Colin sat across from us in the chair that was clearly his chair. I told him what the procurement coordinator had said. I told him what I suspected. I kept my voice level and my hands still. Colin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you directly that someone contacted that office with false information about my company's capacity, and that I believe it was you. He looked at Serena. She looked back at him and said nothing. I continued. I've spent 3 years building something real. You laughed at the idea when I first mentioned it. That was your right. But attempting to damage it is something else. His jaw tightened. I have concerns about industry competition. That's not personal. It's my livelihood, Colin. It is entirely personal. He rubbed his hand across his face. An unfamiliar gesture. I had never seen him look quite like that before. I didn't tell him about the contract. Not that evening. That wasn't why I was there. What I said instead was, I needed you to know that I know, and that what you did not work, and that I expect this family to operate honestly from here forward. Colin looked at the floor. Serena's voice when she spoke was very quiet and very clear. You owe her an apology. The silence that followed was long. Finally, Colin said, I'm sorry, Beverly. His voice was low. There was something genuine in it, buried under pride and discomfort. But present. I nodded once. I drove home that evening along the lake road with the windows down, even though it was too cold for windows down. Gerald was awake, reading, and he looked up when I came in. How did it go? I hung up my coat. I told him everything. He closed his book. And now? I sat down beside him. Now I go back to running my company. The Halton Regional contract changed things considerably. By the end of that year, Whitmore Kitchen Co. had 12 employees and had moved into a larger production facility. We were managing contracts with 4 regional municipalities and serving 42 corporate clients across the greater Hamilton-Burlington area. Fletcher Drummond's company had expanded their engagement to include 3 of their properties. Sandra Okafor had become something like a friend, the kind of friendship that builds quietly over years of honest professional dealings. I was asked to speak at the Hamilton Food Business Incubator's spring event for emerging food entrepreneurs. I stood at the front of a room of 40 people, most of them considerably younger than me, and I talked about the particular challenges of starting a business later in life. About the assumption that age is a limitation rather than simply a fact. About invisible labor, work that people benefit from while forgetting to notice it exists. Afterward, a woman came up to me. She was perhaps 60, perhaps a bit older, with the look of someone who had been useful behind the scenes for a very long time. She told me her name was Pauline. She said she had spent 30 years managing operations for her husband's construction supply company. She said he had recently taken on a business partner who was slowly pushing her role aside. She said she had been thinking about starting something of her own, but felt it was probably too late. I looked at her for a moment. What do you know how to do? I asked her. She told me. Supply chain coordination, supplier relationship management, contract administration, warehouse operations. I reached into my jacket pocket and handed her a business card. Then I said, none of that expires. She looked at the card for a moment. Then she smiled. I thought about her driving home. I thought about all the women like her. Women who had built things quietly and completely under someone else's name for decades. Women who thought experience only counted if it came with a title. It counts! I wanted to tell all of them. Every hour of it counts. You just have to decide it does. Gerald and I drove out to a small inn on Georgian Bay that October, just the two of us. We hadn't taken a proper trip in years. We sat on the porch after dinner watching the light change on the water, and he reached over without looking at me and took my hand. "You're not the same person you were 3 years ago," he said. "I know." He was quiet for a while, then, "You're better." I laughed at that. Or worse, depending on who you ask. Gerald smiled at the lake. "I only asked once and I'm very happy with the answer." We stayed 4 days. I checked email in the mornings and not at all in the afternoons. Agnes held things down with the calm efficiency that was entirely her own. The clients were fine. The kitchen was fine. Everything was fine. I sat on that porch on the last morning and thought about the kitchen table in Burlington where I had first typed the company name into a registration form. The coffee going cold. Gerald's crossword. The quiet November light. I thought about Colin's laughter at that dinner table in Oakville. The particular sound of being dismissed by someone who considers themselves your better. I thought about what it had felt like to click submit. Not triumph, exactly. More like a door opening in a house I had always lived in but never fully explored. Someone asked me recently what I would tell a woman in her 60s who was thinking about starting something new but was afraid people wouldn't take her seriously. I thought about the answer carefully before I gave it. I'd tell her this: the people who won't take you seriously have already made up their minds. You won't change those minds by waiting. You change them by building something they can't ignore, and some of them, not all, but some, will eventually come around. And the ones who don't, well, you build it anyway. You build it for yourself. For every year you spent making yourself smaller to fit someone else's idea of what you were supposed to be, you build it for the woman who stayed up past midnight, fixing someone else's mistakes, and never asked for credit. You build it for your daughter who watched and finally spoke. You build it for the Paulines of the world who think it might be too late. It is not too late. I promise you it is not. If this story touched something in you, I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been told you were too late, too old, too quiet to matter? And where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are right now? I read more of your words than you probably realize, especially late at night when everything else goes quiet.